Welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show. And how good is it to have racing back? It's not often you get to talk about the key warm-up race for the Tour de France and a monument in the same week, but that's exactly what we've got for you today. We'll be looking back at an incredible edition of the Critérium du Dauphiné, as well as Lombardia, the race of the leaves this year. Plus, we'll be rounding up all the other races and racing-related news too. We shall start though with the Dauphiné. Traditionally, this is the big warm-up race for the Tour de France, and with the absence of the Tour of Switzerland this year, it was the warm-up race. Every rider who has ambitions of a good overall result at this year's Tour de France was on the start line, although not many reached the finish line. The truncated 5-day race turned out to be unpredictable, full of surprises, and with an overall result which hung in the balance until the final couple of kilometres. Thanks to all of you who joined us on Race Pass for live coverage. I think we can all agree it was an incredibly exciting finale to the race. Before we get to that finale though, we need to rewind a few days. The race looks set to be another round of the Heavyweight World Championships between Jumbo-Visma and Team Ineos. And it was the Dutch squad who had the upper hand right from stage one. There, the team rode imperiously in support of the man of the moment, Wout van Aert, who duly finished off their hard work to take the stage ahead of Daryl Impey. Egan Bernal of Team Ineos, though, had sneaked himself a few bonus seconds by finishing third on the day. Already on day two, though, we had the first big GC shake-up. Ineos rode on the front for much of the Col de Port, the final climb towards the finish line, but there was nothing that they could do against Jumbo-Visma and nothing anybody could do against Primož Roglič. His acceleration could not be matched, and the fact that it was seated made it even more impressive, or worrying, I guess, if you're one of his rivals. And they'd also be a bit worried, I guess, about his team, not least Sepp Kuss, who chased down an attack by Egan Bernal and made it look as easy as closing the wheel on a recovery ride. And that set the scene, really. Jumbo-Visma looked infallible. Davide Formolo won stage 3, surviving from the break, whilst Roglič was the best of the rest behind. The race overall was starting to look like a foregone conclusion. And then came stage 4. First up, Egan Bernal didn't take the start, citing a minor back problem which he didn't want to aggravate. It left Ineos without a leader, or at least without anyone near the top of the general classification. Then, a crash before the cameras had started rolling on that stage saw Bora Hansgrohe's Emmanuel Buchmann and Gregory Mühlberger abandon the race, along with Jumbo-Visma's Steven Kruijswijk. 3 of last year's Tour de France top 4 all out in the space of just a few hours. And the drama did not stop there. Roglič himself crashed, although despite losing a lot of skin, it didn't look to have affected him too badly, as he more than held his own on a stage won by the young talent that is Lennard Kämna. The crash, though, was clearly more serious than first thought, as yesterday we got rumours and then confirmation that the yellow jersey would not be starting the final stage of the race. All of a sudden, things were wide open, with Thibaut Pinot of Groupama FDJ essentially the new leader of the race, and on the verge of becoming its first French winner in 13 years. What followed was one of the most exciting, enthralling and unpredictable stages that I've seen in a very, very long time. Without one single dominant team to control it, team leaders were forced on the offensive or defensive right from the very beginning, with the likes of Pinot, Lopez, Pogačar, Martinez and Landa all in moves way before the cameras even started rolling. The decisive moment, though, would come on the 5th climb out of 8, with Martinez, Lopez and Pogačar, all major threats to Pinot, heading up the road and catching Alaphilippe and Sivakov, who'd been on their own for quite some time. Sepp Kuss of Jumbo-Visma was also a part of that front group, and on the final drag to the finish line, he sailed away to take a 3rd stage win from 5 for the team. Behind him, there was a drag race between Martinez and Pinot behind him, but ultimately, the Frenchman's heart and those of his fans were broken once again. EF Pro Cycling would emerge triumphant in the race for the 2nd time in 6 years, with Pinot having to settle for 2nd at 29 seconds, and then another Frenchman, Guillaume Martin of Cofidis, rounding out the podium in 3rd place. Now, there are so many talking points from the race that it's quite hard to know where to even start. For Martinez, that is by far the biggest win of his career so far, and he's announced himself as yet another young Colombian climber who could win Grand Tours in a not too distant future. It was a very impressive ride, and he does deserve a lot of kudos for the way in which he did it. For me though, the biggest take home from yesterday was just how exciting racing in the mountains can be without a dominant mountain train. I have absolutely no doubt that if Roglic hadn't crashed, Jumbo-Visma would have had a stranglehold on proceedings in a way that Ineos and Sky have so often done in the past. Now, to be clear, this is not a dig at those teams. I think all of us would employ those exact tactics if we were team managers, but it does really highlight how much more willing or maybe able climbers are to attack when there isn't a dominant force to chase them down or set a pace so high it's impossible to even attack in the first place. Now, the other main talking point was that battle between Jumbo-Visma and Ineos. Had it not been for the crashes, I think I'd be sat here today talking about how Jumbo didn't set a foot wrong. You have Tony Martin, the engine room from the team and the road captain, a man who can control the pace in the bunch on his own for hours on end, day after day. You've got Robert Gesink, the veteran Dutch rider who himself has ridden GC in Grand Tours. He's more than capable of pulling the team over the early mountains each stage. Wout van Aert, who was man of the match really, in my opinion, obviously in the form of his life, and despite all the work he did for his team over the first 5 days, was still able to make the front group in the mountains despite being visibly bigger than anybody else around him on the final stage yesterday. Tom Dumoulin, not quite his former self again just yet, but certainly not too far off it. And then Sepp Kuss, backing up his performances from last year's Vuelta a España and arguably having taken another leap forward. And then there's Kruijswijk and Roglic, third at last year's Tour de France and the winner of the last Grand Tour respectively. Whether they can recover from their crashes in time for the Tour remains to be seen, but if they do, watch out. And for the Tour, they can also add the firepower of George Bennett, himself on the best form of his life. More on that later on. In contrast to Jumbo, you have Ineos. Now they too, of course, have an embarrassment of riches, although they didn't look too well off at the Dauphiné. They may not be panicking, but there is certainly a cause for concern. Bernal, well, I wouldn't be too worried about him. He did prove in the Route d'Occitanie and the Tour de l'Ain that he has got decent form. But their other Tour winners, Geraint Thomas and Chris Froome, finished 37th and 71st overall respectively. Now with Froome, I think that is to be expected, given what happened to him in this very race last year. I don't believe he will be fighting to win the Tour de France this year, but I do believe he can be a crucial domestique if the team decide to take him. With Thomas though, I think there are more questions to be answered. None of us know where each rider was within their training block, etc. But since racing has resumed, he hasn't really shown the signs that he's in the form to win the Tour. Yes, there are still 2 weeks until the Tour starts, longer until the really key stages, but the fact is that the Dauphiné is a week closer to the Tour this year and that 5 of the previous 8 winners of the Dauphiné have gone on to win the Tour de France. So from that point of view, the fact that their best placed rider was 11th is concerning for them. That rider was Pavel Sivakov, who was the most impressive of any Ineos rider over the 5-day race. One thing is for sure, this year's Tour de France is not going to be a one-horse race, or perhaps even a 2-horse race, because there are a whole host of other incredibly talented climbers who are in with a great shout of taking the yellow jersey into Paris. And I, for one, am more excited for the start of the race than I have been in years. And that's saying something because I'm always very excited about it. And I would love to talk more about it now, but we do need to move on to the other racing from last week, and the second monument of the year, in fact, Lombardia. Now, unfortunately, that race was overshadowed by a couple of incidents, one of which was another very serious crash. This time, it was race favourite Remco Evenepoel of De Koning Quick-Step. Now, having looked extremely comfortable over the hardest climb of the day, the Sormano Pass, the young Belgian looked to have been gapped on the descent, with Vincenzo Nibali of Trek Segafredo driving the pace on the front. Now, in pushing to get back onto the wheels in front of him, he appeared to get things a bit wrong in a left-hand corner. He then caught the wall on the side of the road and catapulted over it and down into a ravine on the other side. It was yet another very stark reminder of just how dangerous the sport of cycling can be. Thankfully, before the finish of the race, reports started coming in that he was conscious, and subsequent examinations at Como Hospital revealed that his injuries, whilst bad, were nowhere near as bad as they could have been. So he's fractured his pelvis and has contusions to his lungs, but he's already been transported via plane to a hospital in Belgium where his treatment and recovery will continue. Now, the second major incident involved Max Schachmann of Bora Hansgrohe. Now, he was cut up by a member of the public who'd managed to drive onto the course. The German champion was able to finish the race inside the top 10, but he'd broken his collarbone, and so now his participation at the Tour de France is very much in doubt. So, 2 very different racing incidents. With the former, you might say that there wasn't much that could be done about it. Evenepoel got it slightly wrong in the worst place. However, that descent, a bit like a certain sprint finish in the Tour de Pologne, is notoriously dangerous. So in the last few seasons alone, we've seen some very bad crashes for two other Belgians, Laurens de Plus and Jan Bakelants. And actually, soon after the incident took place, Dan Martin of the Israel Startup Nation tweeted and simply said, "That downhill every year." Now, there's no doubt that cycling is a dangerous sport, and it always will be a dangerous sport, but it does pose more questions about what could be done to mitigate those dangers. So if a descent or a sprint finish is notorious for being dangerous, should it still be used? The answer to that question, unfortunately, only seems to be considered seriously when there's been a crash with serious consequences. Now, the other instance with Schachmann should never ever happen. Fortunately for the German, the resulting injuries weren't too bad, but something similar happened at last year's under-23 version of this same race, and the consequences were far more severe. Ido Mas, a promising young Dutch rider, is now confined to a wheelchair. Now, I think we are all aware of just how complicated it is to close roads for a bike race, but it doesn't really matter how hard or how complicated or how expensive it is. There are just no excuses for something like this happening, not in a monument, not in an under-23 race either. The UCI is now carrying out an investigation. Aside from all of that though, we did have a cracking race at Lombardia. So by the foot of the Sormano descent, it was basically Astana versus Trek, with George Bennett sandwiched in the middle. However, the Kiwi had won the Gran Piemonte one-day race on Wednesday and is obviously in the form of his life. That didn't seem to worry Jakob Fuglsang of Astana though, who rode with incredible confidence. He put in a few accelerations on the final climb of the day, the last of which proved too much for Bennett. Fuglsang would eventually carry on to a solo victory, his second in a monument in just over a year. He also became the first Dane and the third oldest rider in history to win that race at 35 years of age. George Bennett would come across the line 31 seconds later, becoming the first New Zealander to finish on the podium of a monument, whilst Alexander Vlasov, one of the revelations of this season so far, gave Astana a second spot on the podium by finishing in third. Now, hammering home just how hard this edition had been was the fact that every single rider in the top 10 rode across the finish line completely alone, and that the gap between first and 10th place was the biggest we've seen since 1972. The man, incidentally, who was in 10th was Mathieu van der Poel of Alpecin Phoenix. Very impressive, in fact, for a rider who is most certainly not a pure climber. After those races, we got the thoughts of former Tour de France and Dauphiné winner Bradley Wiggins over on the breakaway. So if you haven't already seen it, you can catch that over on Race Pass underneath the Il Lombardia card on the Highlights and Extras tab. Here's a quick snippet for you though.
It was probably too much pressure heaped on him at a young age, touted as a Tour winner. But under Vidakov's guidance and riding with a lot of other Kazakhs and Spanish riders, he really has flourished, and he's gained confidence, I think, as to what he's capable of doing, and it's great to see because he's a very quiet guy. He's won the Dauphiné twice before, and he was up there as a contender for the Tour a few years ago, but for a crash. So he's I think there's strong things to come from him this summer in the Tour de France, maybe, because he's definitely been knocking on the door for a few years.
Moving on, Dwars door het Hageland took place on Saturday. The one-day race in Belgium has multiple gravel and cobbled sectors and produced yet another solo win, this time from Jonas Rickaert of Alpecin Phoenix. Second on the day went to Niels Eekhoff of Team Sunweb, who you may remember won the Under-23 World Championships road race last year in Harrogate before being stripped of the title a short while later. We've also had the first of the 4 stages which make up the Tour de Wallonie, which has attracted a very good field when you consider the other races that have been on at the same time. The first stage there was won in a sprint by Caleb Ewan, which marked the first win for Lotto Soudal since racing resumed. You can catch live coverage and highlights of all the remaining stages over on Race Pass in all the territories in which Race Pass is available. And finally, it was Sheila Gutierrez Ruiz of Movistar who took the honours at La Périgord, coming in ahead of Lebanese of Arkea Samsek and Erat of Canyon SRAM. Unfortunately, the women's racing calendar has been drastically reduced as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we do have live coverage of the Spanish and French national championships for you this week, as well as the Grand Prix Plouay early next week. That, incidentally, is the next round of the Women's World Tour. In other news, the transfer market is pretty busy at the moment. Bahrain McLaren fended off some pretty stiff competition to win the signature of the Australian climber Jack Haig. He signed a 2-year contract with the team, having spent the last 5 years with Mitchelton Scott. Mike Woods will move from EF Pro Cycling over to the Israel Startup Nation, along with Paddy Bevin from CCC and the Australian climber Sebastian Berwick. AG2R have lost the services of Romain Bardet to Sunweb. That rumour was confirmed last week. But they've also massively strengthened their classics lineup. They've now got Greg Van Avermaet and his longtime domestique Michael Schaar, at least from the beginning of 2021. Now, the other major news last week was the cancellation of the UCI World Championships in Switzerland. The sport's governing body are now frantically looking for a new venue to host them, with a number of different possibilities, including apparently combining it with the Liège-Bastogne-Liège one-day race, which wouldn't actually be a first. This was also done all the way back in 1930. Unfortunately though, there are also rumours that if the race is still run this year, it will only be for elite riders and not for juniors or under 23s, which would be a real great shame. Right, that is pretty much all for this week. Don't forget there'll be plenty more racing for you to watch on Race Pass, and also the next episode of The World of Cycling, where I'm going to be joined by long-time cycling journalist Ed Pickering. If you missed last week's show, here is Juan Antonio Flecha going head-to-head at the Inner Tube Challenge with our very own Cy Richardson.
And here goes Richardson, really applying some pace. But Fletcher really doing his best as well. He's got the bigger muscles, you can tell. Fletcher on the left-hand side. He might be in the lead here, but here goes Richardson. Richardson versus Fletcher all the way to the line. It's Richardson who takes it.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, that was close.
Oh, look at that. It's nothing went on. 119. Oh my word. Well, I mean, it might be a stage victory, but for the battle for the overall, it doesn't feel very good.
Yeah, well, I reckon like mine could easily be just below 30 seconds because it wasn't even on. I mean, my tyre was still out. And
you don't have to tell anyone. Honestly, we don't have to admit that. We'll be fine. We'll get you back on in a few weeks' time. This could be like the Dauphiné to your Tour de France performance. So yeah, it'll be fine, mate. It'll be fine.
Have a few weeks for training, putting those tyres on.
You would not believe how disappointed they were not to have beaten my time, although you would believe how pleased I was that they didn't. Right, that is all for this week's GCN Racing News Show. Thanks for your company. I'll see you again soon.